Hello everybody, so welcome back to another video, and today we'll be looking at one of the anti-Sicilian lines that are I think this line is one of the most famous ones out of them. So usually when we talk about the Sicilian defense, we see moves like e4. Firstly, Sicilians played pawn to e4, pawn to c5, and our traditional conservative method of playing is knight to f3 usually, which leads to the open Sicilian. Sometimes we see knight to c3 as well, which is something that I play, the closed Sicilian or the Grand Prix. But today we'll be looking at a little gambit, right? It's one of the most famous gambits, and I'd say a safer gambit actually. You don't sacrifice much, you don't give much, so it's something that you can play even in standard tournaments. It's a gambit that my brother plays as his opening repertoire. Like, most people usually play gambits as a side hustle, but like my brother plays this religiously, so it's perfectly fine to play this. So we'll be looking at the Smith Morra gambit, and it's played with the second move, pawn to d4, offering the exchange even before playing knight to f3. And today I'll just be focusing on the main line of Smith Morra gambit, and if you're black, how or what is your best defense against this. So c takes d4 is the most common variation here. Usually at this move, the Smith Morra gambit is continued with pawn to c3, because queen takes d4 here is just not that good of a move, because it allows something like knight to c6 and gives black an extra tempo. So you can also have a move like knight to f3 here and go back to open Sicilian, but we'll be looking at the Smith Morra gambit. And at this position, actually, black has a lot of moves, right? Black has the traditional capturing, which is what we'll be looking at today, but black also has moves like pawn to d3 and knight to f6. Knight to f6 leads to the a la pin variation, which is what I play with black, but we won't be looking at that today. We'll be looking at the Smith Morra gambit accepted, which is d takes c3. Usually after this, white captures the pawn on c3, and this is actually where the gambit starts. We have knight to c6 by black, and after knight to f3, we just see that, we see usually this move pawn to d6. Now let's just pause here a minute and evaluate the position, right? White is indeed a pawn down. If we count, it's 6 pawns versus 7 on the black side, but the advantage that white has in this position is that, well, we already know that at the beginning of each game, white has an extra tempo, but what sacrificing this pawn does is that it gives you one more extra tempo. So essentially, white is starting off with 2 extra tempos just by sacrificing this one pawn. So if you're a player of the Smith Morra gambit, you have to realize that you cannot drag this game to an equal end game, right? It shouldn't go to the end game if you're playing this. You should either try to gain some substantive advantage in the opening or middle game, or just checkmate him in the middle game, right? Or gain some sort of material. If you let it go, if you exchange too many minor major pieces and let it go to the end game, it won't look good for you as white, because you're already a pawn down, right? And if I just remove all the pieces on the board right now, black would be better because black has an extra pawn, and king pawn endgames, whoever has the extra pawn wins it. So this is one thing you must realize as white. So as black, if you're playing with black, your main motive or idea would be to survive white's extra tempo attack, and at the same time try to exchange queens, try to exchange pieces without damaging your position, right? Try to exchange pieces and bring it to an endgame where you can securely and safely convert this one pawn advantage into a win. So somehow you have to make sure that that extra tempo does not come to haunt you. And as white, you must be aggressive, you must be on the front foot at all times. So that's the kind of narrative that's set up for white and black. Well, the idea of pawn to d6 actually in this position is that it kind of allows development of the light squared bishop on c8, let's say next move g4, followed by an exchange of the knight on f3. And what this does is, as I said, if you're black, you have to strive to exchange pieces. So by taking away white's knight on f3, you're reducing or taking away some sort of tactical chances on white's end by reducing support for this idea, pawn to e4 to pawn to e5. Now, the whole idea of the Smith Morra gambit is that this move pawn to e5 with white is very deadly, and I'll show it to you guys in the coming moves how dangerous it can be. So bishop to g4 and bishop takes f3 removes that e5 danger. So if you're black, you should strive to immediately exchange the knight on f3, and if you're white, you should continue to put pressure and try to break e5 as soon as possible. Right now, after d6, we have the move bishop to c4, which is just simple development of the pieces, nothing too special. White's just trying to develop, castle quickly, and build up an attack. And here we actually have two main options, right? We have knight to f6 and we have pawn to a6. Now, pawn to a6 is the correct move. Always remember this, because knight to f6 is actually a big blunder, because now pawn to e5 works, right? The breakthrough which white wants. So if your opponent plays knight to f6, oblivious and thinking that, oh, okay, two attackers versus one defender, easily winning this situation. No, pawn to e5 still works here, because after d takes e5, queen takes queen, and if king takes queen, then knight to g5, and we have a little bit of trouble on the f7 square. So if knight takes d8, we have knight to b5 here, causing a little bit of trouble on c7. And if you try to protect yourself, let's say king to d7, maybe knight takes e5 is just checkmate, and I think, yeah, just one more move, knight to c7, and it's GG's for you. So king to d7 doesn't work, and this is the idea that white tries to build on, you know, lack of development at black's end and just the king in the center, right? So there's not really much that black can do in this situation. And if black takes knight takes e5, well, that's an even bigger problem, because after knight takes e5, d takes e5, we have this little tactic, bishop takes f7, and after king takes f7, we have queen takes d8, and white wins this game with ease. So that's why pawn to a6 is very important in this position to restrict a move like knight to b5 in the near future. And here white castles, and now knight to f6 works, because now after e5 we can take, and after takes, there is no knight b5, there's no knight d5, there's just knight takes e5, which doesn't pose much of a threat after something like pawn to e6 or bishop to e6. So we will not go e5 here, rather white poses to go queen to e2, which is, I think, the best continuation for white. And after something like bishop to g4, black continues with this plan. We have rook to d1 to stop something like knight to d4. And here, if you're black, I recommend, usually the main line is pawn to e6, but as I stated earlier, we want to reduce white's tactical chances. We want to exchange pieces. I recommend go for bishop takes f3, and after queen takes f3, knight to e5, queen to e2, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, and now you see both sides kind of suffer from development, right? White had sacrificed a whole pawn just to get some sort of development advantage, but we see that both their pieces are equally undeveloped, and after something like rook to c8, possibly, forcing white's queen to go back, maybe something like pawn to b5, we see that both pieces are equally active, both sides are equally active. However, black is a pawn up. So this is the best continuation offered from black. If you're white, you really can't do anything about the situation. So what I'd say is, if you want, this is usually the classic continuation, but if you want, maybe you can charge up your attack quicker. As white, you can go castle after knight f6, queen e2, bishop g4. You can have this rook d1, e5 movement happening faster, possibly, because after rook to d1, bishop takes f3 is kind of a problem, because if he goes e6, then if black goes e6, then e5 possibly still works, supposedly, and you can maybe even go bishop to f4 and keep putting the pressure on. So if you're black, I do recommend going bishop takes f3. It's just a better continuation for black in totality. And yeah, that's the Smith Morra Gambit for you guys.